Okay, so Boker Tov. We are
So,
continuing Masechet Beitzah Daf Zayin Amud Bet. We're on to the second din of the Mishnah. If we just go back to the Mishnah for a moment, very beginning of the Masechet, until now we've been discussing. Remember that we had three cases which were of not really related one to another, but in all of them, the common factor was that they were from Rashi told us at the very beginning, the second Rashi of the Masechet. He said, "So bakazayit mishum dahane itlat mile havu mikule beit Shammai mechumrei beit Hillel." These three cases are cases where Beit Shammai are lenient and Beit Hillel are machmir, which is unusual. It's not unique to these three, but it's unusual. And therefore, they're all taught together in an associative manner in the Mishnahs. The first was the case of Beitzah, which we've discussed at length. The second case is this. It says in the Mishnah, right, Beit Shammai omrim, Sa'or bekazayit, v'chametz bekakotevet, uBeit Hillel omrim, zeh v'zeh bekazayit. Okay, so what are we talking about? We're talking about Pesach. We know that when it comes to chametz and Sa'or, which we'll explain in a moment precisely what the difference is, um, but we have a number of different prohibitions. We have the prohibition of eating, of course, and we also have the prohibition of bayirei or bayimatzeh, of even owning it. Now, at this point, it's not clear what Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai are arguing about. They're arguing about the minimum measurement. We can ask the minimum measurement for which isur, the minimum measurement for eating or the minimum measurement for owning. At this point, let's assume that it's for both. By the way, when we say minimum measurement, we mean, of course, for chiyuv karet or whatever other chiyuv there would be, because even if you eat whatever amount you would eat, that would be forbidden, because the principle is chatzi shiur asur min Torah. That is the machloket in Masechet Yoma between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. We pass like Rabbi Yochanan, where we say chetzi shiur asur min Torah. So even though it's less than the minimum amount for which you'd be liable for punishment, you still would not be allowed to eat it. And chametz is particularly chamor, which the Gemara doesn't really discuss now, but we know from the Gemara Psachim and other places that if that chametz asur afilu b'mashu, if on Pesach the smallest crumb, right, much far less than a kazait, but the smallest amount of chametz would be mixed in with my food, that would be, there is no batel b'shishim, there's no batel b'meha, there's no batel b'matayim, no batel b'anything. That is completely forbidden. That, by the way, is on Pesach, and that's the reason why we're so machmir with so many things. Chametz, the din is that chametz before Pesach is batel b'shishim. So that's why if something is cooked and inadvertently a little bit of chametz gets into it, right? It's batel b'shishim. If it was cooked before Pesach, it would still be kosher for Pesach. That's why in many of the milk products you'll see it says kashlap erev Pesach. Right? Everybody always asks, why does it say erev Pesach? Erev Pesach means if you have on cheese or milk, etc., you'll see this. Means that's another way of saying mahadrin, essentially, because it means it was manufactured erev Pesach, and therefore, even if there was some tarovit chametz, it'd still be mutar. On Pesach itself, not so. There is an opinion, I'll just mention, there's an opinion of the She'iltot that says that chametz on Pesach is batel b'shishim. We don't paskin this way, but if there are enough mitigating factors, then the poskim would be willing to add that as another factor. In any event, so our Mishnah here is talking about the minimum event for which one, the minimum amount, minimum share for which one is liable. So the two shirim which I mentioned here are kazayit, which is familiar to us, that is the size of an olive. Not getting into now the discussion how we measure nowadays how much a kazayit is or not. And then we have a kotevet. Kotevet is maybe a bit of a less familiar amount. That is the amount of a fig. This is the more common measurements we have when it comes to food. We have kazait and we have Beitzah. So Beitzah is much larger. A kotevet is the smallest amount that we have, which is bigger than a kazait. And that's an amount which comes from also in the shirim of Yom Kippur. A kotevet is relevant there. So we have like this. Beit Shammai says when it comes to Sa'or, the minimum amount is a kazait. When it comes to chametz, the minimum amount is a kotevet. So it's a little bit larger. Therefore, Beit Shammai are a little bit more lenient here when it comes to chametz. Beit Hillel omrim zeh v'zeh bekazait. Beit Hillel say no, we make no distinction. Both chametz and Sa'or, the minimum amount is a kazait. What is the difference between chametz and Sa'or? So chametz, we know what it is more or less. Sa'or is essentially, I think in English it translates as sourdough, but that's where you have the chametz is where the dough itself is risen, where it's edible. Se'or has an advantage and a disadvantage over chametz. The disadvantage is that it's not really edible. The understanding is that se'or is something which you wouldn't really eat by itself. However, it has the ability to cause other items, to cause you put it in with other dough, it would make that become chametz. So it's got a chumrah and a kula. In that the se'or itself would not be eaten, but it can make other things become chametz, whereas chametz is already chametz, that's it, but you can eat it itself. So therefore, Beit Shammai says that with se'or we have to be more machmir because it has the ability to make other things chametz. So back to our Gemara now on Daf Zayin Amud Bet, quotes this line of the Mishnah. It says Beit Shammai se'or b'kazait, etc. Says the Gemara, Ma'ita ma'ut Beit Shammai. Right? We don't really need to ask on Beit Hillel here because I guess our default understanding would be that se'or still fits into the prohibition of chametz on Pesach. So if it's a kazayit, it's all a kazayit. Why did Beit Shammai come and differentiate it? This is a kazayit, this is a kotevet, right? So my tamayut to Beit Shammai answers the Gemara, im ken lichtov rachman chametz v'lo ba'isor. In other words, im ken, meaning if it was true that what? This is one of those things where if you're not used to the language of Gemara, it can be a little bit tricky. You say im ken, you think it means if so. We expect the Gemara to tell us if what was so, but it doesn't tell us if what was so. It's as if there's three dots here. So Rashi fills in the gap. He says im ken techad shiur l'tarvayim. In other words, if it was true what Beit Hillel said, that it was the same shiur for both chametz and se'or, right? This is Beit Shammai's claim. In that case, then we'd say lichtov rachman chametz v'lo ba'isor. Then you would expect the Torah to mention chametz and not to mention se'or. But we'll see in the psukim, the Torah does differentiates between the two. For example, you should have it on the side of the Gemara. Have a look. It says, it's in Parshat Bo, matzot yachel et shiva. It's the first pasuk which quotes it here on the daf. It says, matzot yachel et shivat hayamim. You should not have seen, again, bal yera'eh, we've mentioned this before, but I'll just say again, the Gemara Pesachim learns out, when it says lo yera'eh lecha, it means it should not be seen to you. In other words, bal yera'eh is a prohibition of owning it yourself. Somebody asked me once, they said they wanted to go to the old city on Pesach, and when they walked through, maybe not in the old city, but sometimes they sell, the Arab carts outside selling their breads and things, or they wanted to go somewhere and there was they could see bread on Pesach. So was that a prohibition? There's no prohibition because it's not yours, it's got nothing to do with you. But they thought because it says by Yira'eh, you weren't allowed to see it. So no, but here where it says by Yira'eh, but it says lo Yira'eh lecha chametz v'lo Yira'eh lecha se'or, it distinguishes between the two. So says Beit Shammai, im ken lichtov rachman chametz v'lo ba'isor. If it didn't want to distinguish between the minimum amount of chametz and se'or, it would have said one thing. It wouldn't have differentiated in the pasuk. Vana amina, I would have said, ma chametz she'en chimutzo kasher bekazayit se'or shechimutzo kasher lo kol sheken. Right? I would have said chametz she'en chimutzo kasher. In other words, that it does not have the ability to cause chimutz now another dough. It's already finished. It's not. So therefore, ein chimutzo kasher, and that's already a kazait. So the sourdough shechimutzo kasher, that does have the ability to cause chimutz to take place and other things. So that would be a kol sheken. Obviously, that would also be forbidden with a kazait. So therefore, that's if it had just said, if it had not mentioned them separately. But now that the pasuk says lo yira'eh lecha chametz and lo yira'eh lecha se'or, so says Beit Shammai se'or dekatav rachmana lamali. Why does it say? Why does it mention se'or specifically? Lomar lecha, to teach you shiros shel zeh lo kashiros shel zeh. Right, the amounts are not the same since they are mentioned each one by itself. Therefore, you learn that they have a different shiur. There's going to be some difference, otherwise it wouldn't be mentioned. That's Beit Shammai. Says Rashi, Shiro shel zeh v'chulei. Says Lahachi lo yalef se'or michametz, and therefore he says that is why Beit Shammai do not learn se'or from chametz. Mishum de chametz bekakotevet. And that's why Beit Shammai says, Beit Shammai's whole reasoning area is that seor, which has the capacity to cause, to make something else machmitz, therefore that's going to be more chamor, and therefore that's going to be with a kazayit. Therefore he says that chametz is going to be with a kotevet. Delot tema dayolavon min adin liot kanidon. Right? Don't say that it's going to be exactly the same. So, or nami b'kakotevet, and to say that therefore so will also be with a kotevet. La'achi katzve behedya l'shu'ule b'shu'ula zuta v'shu'ula laba. That's why each one is taught explicitly to tell you that one has a larger share and one has a smaller share. La'achi nakat kotevet. So why kotevet? Where do you get this from? Kazait, I understand. Kazait is always our default measurement, the minimum measurement when it comes to food. Where does kotevet come from? Kotevet is what we say. That's the minimum amount where one is basically satiated. That's why that's what the Gemara says in Yom regarding eating on Yom Kippur. Inami shiurin halacha leMoshe miSinai. Or alternatively, you would say that the shiurim are a halacha leMoshe miSinai. You could ask the question: if the shiurim are a halacha leMoshe miSinai, I think Tosfot asked this question. But if it's a halacha leMoshe miSinai, then why do you have to learn from the pasuk that this one and that one? So maybe it means to say only that we need the pasuk to teach us that it's a separate shiur. But once we know from the pasuk that it's a separate shiur, what is that shiur going to be? That is a halacha leMoshe miSinai. Okay, but that's how Beit Shammai learned. Beit Hillel. So how do they learn? So back in the Gemara we say Ubeit Hillel. Okay, we're about halfway down the narrow lines, but past that. Beit Hillel. Tricky. Now, Beit Hillel say it's the same shir for this and for that. So why do they say that the pasuk distinguishes between chametz and sor? Beit Hillel tricky. They need it. Ikatav rachmana saol havamina mishum dechimotzo kasher. Aval chametz te'en chimotzo kasher. Emalo tricha. Right? You need both, and it's only by the fact that the pasuk explicitly states chametz and seor that I know that both of them are you'd be chayav for the share of a kazayit. Why? It says Beit Hillel. If it had just said seor, so you would have said, well, seor is more chamor. Same reason that Beit Shammai said, because it's chimutzol kasher, because it has the capacity to cause other things to become chametz. Aval chametz the ein chimutzol kasher, chametz which does not have that capacity, emalo. You would have said no. You would have said it's not going to be a kazayit. It's going to be you're going to need more. So therefore tzricha. Therefore you need them both. What about the other way around? The I katav rachmana chametz. If it had just written chametz, well then you would have said it's chametz which you're going to be chayav on a kazayit. Why? Mishum dera'oi lachila, because that is ra'oi lachila. That is fit for eating. Aval se'or she'en ra'oi lachila eimalo. But when it comes to se'or, which is not really fit to be eaten, you would have said no. And then you would have said it's only if you have a larger amount that you'd be chayav, and therefore tzricha, and therefore you need both. By the way, again, the Gemara does not really get into it here. When we mention se'or, there's a whole sugya in the Gemara Pesachim in terms of what's called chametz nukshe, which is chametz, which is not really edible. Where we normally get into questions is something which could be somewhat edible, but something which could, or we'd say is ra'oi la'achila l'yedei adchak. That's generally the definition of chametz nukshe, which is something which, generally speaking, our preference would be not to eat it, but it can be eaten. Something which is not edible at all. But so you get into the whole question of alcohols, of shampoos and cosmetics and all things like that. So there are many poskim who would say, there are those who are machmir, but many poskim would say that once something is completely, it's inedible, nobody would eat it. It's been removed from the name of the food. So at that point, we don't really have to be concerned for it for chametz. Certainly not if you're not going to consume it or anything like that. Okay, so. Right, so that was Beit Hillel. Beit Hillel just explained why we need both. Just read it again. Beit Hillel tzrichi. The ikatav rachman asor hava mina mishum chimutzol kasher v'chametz ein chimutzol kasher malo. Saor has got the chumra that it can cause other things to become chametz, so therefore tzricha. The ikatav rachman chametz mishum deroi lachila aval saor she'en roi lachila malo tzricha. Okay. But when it comes to chametz, that is the chumra that it's really edible. Now, Asks the Gemara the following question: Beit Shammai late Lud Rabbi Zera. To Beit Shammai not have the following din of Rabbi Zera? Do they not learn this? Damar Rabbi Zera, Patach HaKatuv b'Seol, v'siyem b'chametz, lomar lecha, zeu Seol, zeu chametz. So now we have a problem. Beit Hillel understood. We started off with the following: the psukim distinguish between Seor and chametz. They mention them differently. So Beit Hillel explained why. But Beit Shammai said the fact that they are each one mentioned individually comes to show you they have a different din, they have a different shiur. But Rabbi Zera said, hang on a second. Rabbi Zera said, Patach HaKatuv b'Seol, v'siyem b'chametz. You look at the psukim, it starts off talking about Seor, it ends off talking about chametz, when it's all talking about the same thing. And therefore, Omar Lecha, which teaches you, Zeu Seol, Zeu chametz. That really, these, have a look at Rashi. He says, Patach HaKatuv b'Seol, Seol lo yimatzeh b'vatechem, v'siyem b'chametz, ki kol ochel machmetzet. Metzet is chametz, same thing. V'aval elamichtav, ki kol ochel Seol. That's over there, it's in the same pasuk. So why does the pasuk start off talking about Seol and then ends off talking about chametz when it's really talking about the same thing? It's not like the pasuk we saw before where it mentions them separately. Here it mentions the same item. Says Rashi, "V'aval elamichtav ki kol ochel Seol." It should have said Seol. Because one is talking about the onesh and the azara, bringing us back to makot, some of the concepts we learned over there. But he says, Zeu Seol Zeu chametz kazeh ken zeh. In other words, that pasuk is implicitly teaching you that they're the same thing, that they have the same din at the very least. There is no distinction. So says the Gemara like this: Le'inyan achila kulei alma lo pligi. So you're right. When it comes to eating, everybody agrees. Everybody meaning Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, that for achila, if one was to eat chametz or seor, then it would be the same amount for which one would be chayav. Again, anything that you eat, even if you eat a mashu on Pesach, that's going to be asur, because chatzi shor asur min Torah. But if you eat, but if you eat kazayit, then you're going to be chayav. So says Rashi, le'inyan achila kulei amalo plegi, afilu Beit Shammai modu. The chametz chayav bekazayit keseor ba'achilato. Even Beit Shammai agrees that if one was to eat a kazayit of chametz on Pesach, you'd be chayav for that, just as you would for seor. It's the same. Uchta Rabbi Zera, just like Rabbi Zera said. Aval lebe'ur leBeit Shammai lo yishvu. When it comes to owning chametz or seor, when it comes to seor bali matzeh, and of owning and of having to destroy it, so there Beit Shammai say lo yishvu. They're not the same. Because there the pasuk separated them. L'tavayu lo yireh lecha chametz lo yireh lecha seor. Lo yafina lemeima ki echi devachila. Since it distinguished between them for lo yireh, you can't say the same as you would by achila. Ki echi devachila yishva katuv achilat chametz lebiur seor af lebiur lo yishva lo. So in other words, don't say that. Just as they were the same for achila, they'd be the same for biur. Since they were taught separately, they were written separately, there's a distinction in their shiurim. So says the Gemara. Again, we're now going on to the first of the wide lines in the Gemara. Just before that, we say le'inyan achila kulei amalo pligi. When it comes to eating, there is no argument. Ki pligi le'inyan biur. The argument is when it comes to biur, a little bit strange. The language the Gemara here uses of biur, when it comes to bayir matzeh, there are essentially three mitzvot that we have. There are two negative mitzvot: not to own any chametz. Right? There's bayir and bayir matzeh. Again, the Gemara in Pesachim talks about the difference between those two. But there's also a positive mitzvah of tashbitu, of destroying it. So yeah, we're talking about use the language of biur, of you have to destroy, but it would apply passively for if you would own it as well. Beit Shammai savri lo yalfinan biur ma'achila. Beit Shammai hold we don't learn out the dinim regarding biur from achila. Ubeit Hillel savri yalfinan biur ma'achila, and Beit Hillel say no, we do, and therefore that's why they are have a machloket between them, whether it's the same shiur regarding chametz and so. By the way, one of the things you see from here, this is one of the sources, that when it comes to owning chametz, we talk about a kazayit. And that's why when it comes to bdikat chametz on Erev Pesach, and it comes to cleaning our homes, etc., we're always very, very concerned, the kitchen, etc., any place that's going to come into contact with food, to get rid of even crumbs. Because there, we're not just dealing with Bayir Bayim Matzeh, but there we're dealing with preventing ourselves from eating chametz on Pesach, advertently, inadvertently. But the places where you're cleaning, where it's just for the mitzvah of Bayir Bayim Matzeh, if you have less than a kazayit of chametz in that place, where there's no way it's going to come into your food, seemingly there would not be a prohibition. Chatzisha applies to eating, it may not apply to this, and that is what the Gemara Pesachim also talks about. Crumbs specifically. That is why, according to most poskim, crumbs, etc., in a place that's never going to come into contact with your food, there would not be a prohibition of Ba'er Bayim Matzeh Pesach. Okay, says the Gemara now in the second wide line. It says Itmar Nami, Amar Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina, Machloket le'inyan biur, aval le'inyan achila, divrei hakol zeh v'zeh bekazayit. Okay, so that's another statement in the Amoraim of Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina saying exactly what we've just said. The machloket between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel is regarding biur, but would not be regarding achila. Everybody agrees there. It's a kazayit. And we have another Beitzah Tanya Nami Achi, which also supports what we've just said. Says Rashi, Tanya Nami Achi. What is the Tanya Nami Achi? Meaning we have a Beitzah which also supports this. Supports what? The biul hu the pligi, that the machloket is regarding biul and not regarding velo ba'achila. So Tanya Nami Achi, L'ayir elacha. So here again, there's a bit of a switch in the Girsaot. The Girsa you'll see in the Gemara, it says here in brackets seor and then chametz, but the pasuk actually says it the opposite way around. So it should read v'lo yareh lecha chametz, v'lo yareh lecha seor. But that is the pasuk that we saw. It says zeo machloket sheben Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. This is precisely the machloket between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel because it says seor and chametz in that pasuk separately. Shebeit Shammai omrim seor bekazayit v'chametz bekakotevet. Right? Beit Shammai say that when it comes to Seor, you've already transgressed the Kazayit, and Chametz already with a Kotevet. Beit Hillel Omrim, Zev Kazayit. Beit Hillel say each one is with a Kazayit. How is that a brighter support? Now we understand why. Rashi told us, which felt compelled to say, that it's related to biur and not achila, because that is the contents of the pasuk. It's lo yera'eh, lo yera'eh lecha chametz, lo yera'eh lecha seor. That from the fact that the Torah distinguished specifically when it comes to the mitzvah of Bayir or Bayim Matzeh, and not when it comes to the prohibition of eating, so that's where we learn, that is where the machloket is between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. So initially, our Hava Amina, we understood maybe from the Mishnah that Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel were arguing even regarding the Isur of Achila. What comes out very clearly from the Gemara is that no, when it comes to achila, both according to Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, whether it's chametz, whether it's or whatever it is, the yisur would be kazayit. When it comes to bayira'eh, what is the minimum amount of which one is going to be liable? So according to Beit Shammai, according to Beit Hillel, it's still going to be a kazayit, whether it's chametz or seor. According to Beit Shammai, for seor would be a kazayit. For chametz, they're a bit more lenient, and they say would be a kotevet. Okay, so that's the end of the sugya over there. As you can hear, my voice isn't doing too well, so we'll end over there for today. And wish everybody a good day.
Thank you
very much. Refuah Shlema.
Very good. Shkoyach. Thank you.